I want to welcome everyone today to the Texas Medical Device Alliance quarterly panel. Today, our topic is FDA medical device regulations, including the emergency use authorization. I want to take a few minutes and go over some housekeeping items for today. The first thing is a very exciting announcement. If you have not already, please check out our new format of our newsletter. You can find that at bioaustinctx.com. I have dropped that link into the chat box. If you have a few minutes, go ahead and check it out. And of course, sign up if you have not already. Also, during this call, please mute yourself if you are not speaking. And also, please, if you are an attendee, please turn your video off so that we can limit the distractions. Later on in the event, we'll have some question and answer, and of course, you're welcome to share your video at that time. Also, in the background, if you don't mind, please go ahead and mute your cell phones. So again, we can limit those distractions. During our conversation today, of course, we have our moderator and our panelists will be handling a conversational discussion. So during that time, surely you're going to have questions or maybe some comments to share. We recommend and definitely encourage you to share those questions or experiences in the chat box. Myself and Elisa will be monitoring the chat box and forwarding those questions to the appropriate moderator or panelist for discussion. And of course, as we talk through this, make note of things that are relate to you and maybe some experiences you have to share. We would definitely like to hear about those in the following Q&A session. As you know, the first half of this call is going to be our moderator and panelists discussing with their expertise kind of what's going on in the FDA world at the moment. And then the last half, we would like to hear from you guys, questions, experiences, and things like that. Before we begin, I would like to take a few minutes to introduce our sponsors. Let's go through those. We'll start with CAI, Emergo UL, BSI, Med to Market, QA Consulting, Greenlight Guru, Qualio, Stat King Clinical Services, Dickinson Wright PLLC, Galen Data, Avamine, and our in-kind sponsors, ENT Vantage Diagnostics, Health Tech Insight, Technology in Motion, Artemis Communications, Oriel Stata Matrix, and of course, 510K Cafe. All right, moving on to, well, I'd have to get this off my screen first here. Moving on to our discussion today, I would like to introduce our moderator, and then our moderator is going to take some time to introduce our panelists today. Our moderator, Billie Ward, would you give us a wave? Hi, Billie. Billie Ward is a healthcare attorney with Dickinson Wright PLLC and chairs the firm's FDA and commercial products group. She has specialized experience advising life sciences companies, healthcare providers, and institutional review boards concerning regulatory and contract issues associated with clinical investigations and human subjects protections. She provides counsel to medical device, cosmetic, and other commercial product manufacturers, distributors, and importers on FDA requirements and other regulatory and practical considerations concerning applicable product classifications, pre-market strategy, advertising and promotion, and other product development, commercialization, and compliance matters. Billie, I'll hand it over to you if you want to get our panelists introduced and get talking.
Thank you. I just want to say good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for having me. It's been, I've been talking to my colleague, Lance Anderson, who I know is involved with the Alliance, about attending one of these meetings. So I'm happy to finally be part of and able to moderate this panel. We hope to have a really interesting and informative discussion on the EUA process and other FDA trends that we've seen recently. So I just want to take a minute to very briefly introduce our panelists, you can find more lengthy descriptions of their background and experience on the bio, on the TMDA website. And I think their bios were also shared previously by email. But by way of brief introduction, our first panelist is Patti Rossman. She's president and founder of Globio, where she provides regulatory and quality assessments and strategies to life science companies. She's co-founded various other life science companies, and throughout the pandemic, she has assisted numerous medical device and IVD companies with their EUA requests and their 510K submissions. Our next panelist is Julie Thomas. She's Vice President of Operations for BioStable Science and Engineering. Julie has over 30 years experience in the pharmaceutical and medical device industries, pardon me, including 20 years at Johnson & Johnson and several roles at medical device startups. Her expertise ranges from quality and regulatory to manufacturing, engineering, and plant management. And then our final panelist is Carrie Hetrick. She is Director of Regulatory Affairs for Sterling Medical Devices. Carrie has over 20 years of medical product regulatory management in the biomedical device industry, ranging from small venture-backed companies to large publicly traded corporations. Carrie has extensive experience helping companies navigate the regulatory challenges in the US and internationally, and piloting clinical and operational challenges at each stage of development. So we're excited to have our panelists here today and have a lively discussion about these new and emerging FDA trends and topics. The first thing I'd like to do, though, is to give a brief overview of the emergency use authorization process and mechanism that the FDA has available. Many of you probably are already aware of the process, so this may be old news to you, but for those who maybe don't have this background information, it should be helpful to kind of set the stage for our discussion today. The emergency use authorization is a mechanism that's available to the FDA under Section 564 of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act. It's a temporary mechanism that is outside of the traditional approval and clearance pathways. So the intent here is that it is a process by which the FDA can approve or authorize approved products for use or approved products for unapproved uses during the course of an emergency. So to set the context, this is a mechanism that is available in the course of a public health emergency, which has been declared and is only available once the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services issues a declaration that the circumstances exist to justify this use by the FDA to approve products. When a product is authorized for an EUA, the authorization extends through the course of the emergency, but not after. So it is a temporary mechanism, which then must be followed up with the traditional either 510K or whatever the appropriate approval process is or clearance process. So I'd like to turn it over to the panelists and to kind of start off our discussion with that background being set, just invite our panelists to discuss their experience with the FDA, particularly over the course of the pandemic, and also just their experience with the EUA process generally, both during COVID and before. So why don't we start with Patti, and maybe you can kick things off for us.
Sure, I'd be glad to. So we do have some prior experience with throughout the whole pandemic with submitting EUA applications. At first, it was pretty much a wild ride in that anything and everything could be submitted, and the FDA would have a response to you as to whether or not they wanted to review your work, your project, your product within a few days. And they would work with you very closely to answer all your questions and make sure that if you did have a a product that they felt could be helpful in this horrible pandemic, that you would have your opportunity to get it to market. One of the things about EUA's authorizations is that the product has to be a needed product to help in the emergency. So as more and more, particularly molecular diagnostic tests done in labs, as more and more of those were authorized, the FDA finally said, no more, we're not going to look at anymore. So they have slowed down on EUAs, but there's still definitely a push for innovation and new products that will help during this pandemic. One of the big things that we noticed with submitting EUAs is that the FDA for the first time has templates. It's very easy, if you have the data, it's very easy to submit now because you know exactly what to submit on the FDA templates.
Is that something that you've found is different from EUA? Because the EUA process has been available pre-COVID as well, and there have been other emergencies declared. So is that a difference that you've seen in the COVID pandemic?
Yes, it definitely is. The templates, there's a template for each kind of IVD, for instance. And at first, those templates were changing rapidly as the FDA learned more and more about the information that they needed. In fact, sometimes they would change weekly with the data that was required.
That's helpful. Carrie, how about you? What have you seen? What has your experience been with the EUA process, or just dealing with the FDA generally over the past 16 months or so?
Very fast. They're a lot. They're very quick to respond. I mean, we were getting responses initially, like on a Saturday night or on a Sunday, they were responding, you know, and as the guidances and the templates were coming out, you know, they would expect you real time to update your submissions as they were coming out, and or, you know, they'd have you update them, even though it'd be published, you know, a few days later, you'd be expected to update it, and then they'd republish your, you know, the sponsors letters and such as data became available. They'd also, you know, as more data came available too, they'd be real quick to withdraw submissions. You'd see them as well. So, and it's slowed down significantly as well. I've seen, you know, and they're starting to discontinue them. So as products are becoming more and more available, and or as the pandemic has been slowing down and products are becoming more, you know, they've been withdrawing EUAs and such as that. So, you know, there is a big push towards innovation, but I think, you know, if you look at, like, you know, there's a huge, the REID panel or FDA learning, what is that? The CDRH learning thing is next week, and their big push is on innovation and new products and going back to the way it was for next, you know, for moving forward. They want people to start pushing and submitting 510K submissions again, and submitting everything that was in as emergency use. They also want you to submit so that they can continue with, you know, how we used to be, business as usual. And hopefully, you know, I don't think the EUA process is going to go away. We still have, you know, anthrax panels and submissions for that are out there. So,
well, that's a good point, that the EUA process isn't going to go away, and it's been existing even prior to the pandemic. But with regard to, you know, if people are looking to get a COVID-related product to market, do you think that the EUA process is still a viable option? And this, I would throw this out to Patti as well. Or is the FDA moving in such a fashion with their, because they've been prioritizing the products that are needed, right? And are now, you know, not accepting EUAs for certain products where the supply is there. So, you know, how would you advise a company that's looking to market a COVID-related product?
There are 510Ks that have been cleared for COVID products now that you will see. So you can get your product cleared, IVDs cleared for COVID indications.
And I do think that it depends on the product. I've recently been engaged with a product that is, it's so innovative and it's so needed that the FDA representatives are actually attending update meetings with the sponsor. So this is how close they will get to the actual sponsor and the authorization track if it's a product that they feel is really, really beneficial to the U.S. population, and not just individuals, but for a public health requirement as well.
And if you look at, the digital health technologies, innovation, the way that's going, I don't think, monitoring patients digitally is going to go away. I think that the world has now looked at that, and remote patient monitoring is easy. It's, doctors are liking the fact that they can do remote teledoc, patient visits. You don't need, it's a kind of a new twist on house visits. You can go visit your patients at home without actually doing a house call. And so the agency has been really hesitant with digital health in the past, and computers and artificial intelligence and all this stuff. It moves faster than the agency is, but they've had to get on board, and the whole digital health group has had to try to get on board and move as fast as technology moves. And I think they've put a lot of incentives and innovations in place to try to get up to speed with.
I totally agree with that. And I think another thing that the pandemic has fostered is more willingness at the FDA to accept real world evidence. Because with the pandemic and social distancing and people unwilling to go into healthcare facilities to participate in clinical trials, real world evidence became very, very much necessary to get some of these very needed products to the marketplace. And I don't think that's going to go away. I hope it doesn't anyway, because the traditional clinical trials have become so expensive and so difficult. And with the COVID patients, there's really a competition for our patients for our clinical trials. So this real world evidence acceptance by the FDA, I think, is really an innovative approach that will hopefully speed up the process of approval. And not only that, but perhaps even make products safer and more efficacious, because we can see evidence of them having been used in real settings.
Yeah, and why don't, just for the audience's benefit, for those who may not know, when you talk about real world evidence, elaborate a little bit on what you mean by that. We're talking about wearables and information from devices. Just can you kind of elaborate on the type of data that would be involved or included within that?
Sure. Well, real world evidence is any data or evidence that is generated apart from a formal clinical study or clinical trial. So it can be data from wearables, it can be data from electronic health records, it can be data from insurance companies, monitoring activities, any kind of information that is not generated in a formal clinical trial.
That's great, thank you. And kind of talking about the digital technologies, Obviously, I think everybody on the call understands that that's here to stay. It's a really evolving area, quickly evolving area that's going to continue to be as such. So I'm just curious, with the new technologies that you guys have seen that the FDA has looked at, are there certain ones that you think really have longevity? Are there any other trends that you might see going forward? Not getting into too much detail on this. I know we could spend hours talking about this issue alone, but if you could just elaborate on those issues, that would be great. Carrie, I'll throw that out to you. I should direct my question so you know when to speak up.
Okay, so repeat that. I apologize.
My question just relates to the types of digital technologies that you think are here, you know, for the long haul, or the direction that these technologies are moving in.
So I think, you know, there's a lot of technologies that you've seen evolve with the digital health. So there's the telemonitoring where you can, you know, monitor patients remotely. So whether it be from the nurse's station in the OR where you're, you know, or you have, you know, patients at home, and you have doctors who can monitor the patients, you know, from there, or, you know, you're looking at them just from, you know, different locations in different places, all the way from, you know, radiologists looking at x-rays at a different place, or, you know, to looking at different demographic information, or looking at different clinical information, or looking, it's just, we see it all over. There's just a multitude of different algorithms and different machine learning and augmented realities and different types of devices that you're able to look at different patient data, let's just say. So anything from your watches and Fitbit and Google, you can, you know, look at patient data from temperature monitoring, right? I'm up here in Colorado, so we just had the MLB big thing here, you know, with the national versus went down to a couple of those activities. And for example, UC Health had a big thing where you walk into, it's like, it was like like instead of the airport, you walk through, you know, like instead of looking for bombs and stuff, they were monitoring your temperature. So you walk in and it gave a temperature monitor to see if you were, you know, if you had a high temperature, and you could go in or out. And so, I mean, it's just crazy what you can do now with all this stuff and looking at people's health and stuff. So it's not going to go away. It's going to get faster. It's going to get better. And, you know, there's a plethora of information you can do monitoring, you know. So we just, you know, there's what we've seen and what I've seen with the FDA and a lot of the stuff we've submitted lately, you know, FDA is having a really hard time with the algorithms and digital learning and cybersecurity and all these different things around there, where there's static algorithms, there's machine learning algorithms where you put the data in and the algorithms can change, or there's the machine learning and they can keep learning and learning and learning, and the algorithms no longer can, you know, they keep changing, and the FDA really has a hard time with that one. They don't know what to do quite with that one yet, but all of that information and the way, I don't know, the way this pandemic and the way how fast everything's going, and you know, the whole innovations and breakthrough designations. And Elisa, we can probably get her in here, even though she's not on our panel, but she's gone through and she's gotten through some of these breakthrough designations and innovative learning and product, which I think this pandemic has really pushed the FDA's limits into helping them actually see that we can get, you know, more products through faster.
Yeah, the FDA certainly has pivoted through the course of this, and I think technology is a good example of where they're going to have to continue to do that.
Change is hard because they've had a hard time with all this.
Right. I think one of the big areas Really, where I see a lot of acceptance. I'm getting echo. Is that me echoing? Okay. I see one area that I think is really changing is artificial intelligence used in radiology. During the pandemic, of course, we had this phenomenon of COVID lungs, which has a different kind of look on a CT. And there were several companies that I've worked with and been informed about that are working on and have worked on being able to visualize this COVID lung on an X-ray instead of having to go to a CT scan. And the radiologist still has the final call, but the digital part of the radiology software will actually give them an indication of whether or not that patient has COVID or has COVID lung per se. So I think radiology is really going to advance due to this pandemic.
Absolutely. Well, I don't want Julie to think we forgot about you. So Julie, I want to go back a little bit and get your thoughts on just the general topic of what your experience has been with the FDA, in particular over the past 16 months.
Yes. Kind of tailing on to what the other panelists have said, they have really kept their focus on everything that's related to COVID-19, diagnostics, in-home collection and testing, point of care. And then I think now they're seeing that those are going to branch into new areas unrelated to COVID, cancer detection, and some other things like that. So I think they will continue to focus resources on those types of technologies because they can be used in other areas. And as they said, a big time focus on the wearables, and FDA is having to determine, what's a medical device and what's a consumer-based device, such as an Apple or Fitbit or Whoop. The trend towards getting patients more involved in their own health data and encouraging active lifestyles, and then connecting all that through the digital health, remote care, telemedicine that we've been talking about, which then makes FDA put more resources into cybersecurity. It's a big deal with patient information. They're developing guidance documents, which sometimes they're more active than others. Some have been relegated to the B list, but they're trying, I think. They have opened up their Digital Health Center of Excellence, just kind of their action plan for how they want to integrate digital health into the FDA's normal business routine. And lastly, they continue to focus on the turf battle between HHS and FDA on laboratory developed tests. And I know others are going to talk about that a little bit more, but as from a resource standpoint and a focus, I think that's another important one.
Yeah, that's a really important one. Diagnostics, obviously, I think everybody probably understands that's been a really strong focus through the course of this pandemic. So the VALID Act was introduced in 2020 initially and reintroduced in June, I think, of this year. So Patti, can you talk a little bit about that? Explain the VALID Act and how that's going to impact regulation of IVDs and laboratory developed tests?
Well, I can explain what I know about it. And you probably know more about it than I do, being an attorney. But I do know a little bit about it. So the purpose of the VALID Act, both the first one and the second one that's just been introduced, by the way, they're bipartisan bills. So they have support, broad support, but the intent is to take a regulation of what is going to be called in vitro clinical tests away from the regulation of other kinds of medical devices. So in vitro clinical tests now includes, or will include, the IVDs that we've traditionally known, plus laboratory developed tests. And these, the regulations around these two entities classified as IVCT the regulation will be risk-based. So some of these products will have high scrutiny. Some of them will simply have to be listed with the FDA and not even reviewed. No substantial equivalence required. And then there will be a moderate category that will be kind of in between the two. But finally, I think we're going to get out of this LDT conundrum that we've been in for my whole career. And Julie's laughing, so it's probably been for her whole career as well. And the pandemic kind of forced this issue because we had laboratories, high complexity laboratories, CLIA high complexity laboratories developing tests for COVID, especially, well, antibodies and antigen tests. And the FDA was going to review them, and it wasn't going to review them, and it was going to review them, and it wasn't again. So this hopefully will clear up that issue that we've known about for a long, long time. We've tried to fix it, but this pandemic really threw it up there into the big screen and said, hey, you know, where does this fall?
And we've seen, you know, we mentioned the prioritization of the FDA, the products that they're prioritizing as far as EUAs, and it's kind of run the gamut from, you know, respirators to now, you know, testing and in particular at-home testing. So yeah, this has been a significant issue. If you're advising clients on COVID-related products and trying to figure out how to approach the FDA on it, one of the things I've found is that the FDA has been very, I guess, in my view, proactive on trying to get resources out to people, trying to be available to answer questions, and to provide information to the extent that they can. They've held weekly town hall meetings, which I have found to be helpful at times. So I guess just trying to give people an idea of how to strategize in approaching the FDA with respect to their products, and obviously it's going to differ based on the product. But can the three of you provide some thoughts on that?
It also differs on what division you're dealing with. So, I mean, that completely depends. So there's your normal regulatory answer, it depends. But each division is, you know, there's some divisions that are a lot more interactive than others. So that's the first part. And it depends on which product is hot right now and where the biggest need is. So, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, you know, as that, oh, go ahead, Patti.
For non-COVID products, it's going to get a little bit easier. During the pandemic, it was very difficult to get attention for anything that wasn't COVID related. But now the people that have been pulled from different areas of the agency to review COVID related products have now gone back to their areas. And I see that loosening up a little bit, that you get a little bit more traction now than during the pandemic.
And I think they sourced incorrect people in certain areas as well, trying to get different people. You would see during meetings, there would be the wrong people and the wrong sources. So I think, you know, hopefully, you know, now that they're starting to get the right people into the right areas.
Yeah, it did feel for a bit, you know, through this pandemic that it was an all hands on deck type of situation.
And a little haphazard in other areas.
Yeah. And I think they're starting to, the waters are starting to settle a little bit. But Julie, I did like to get your thoughts on how you think the FDA is kind of bouncing back from this intense focus on COVID to now, sort of being able to at least give a little attention to some other product categories.
Right. They kind of have a lot on their plate. Executive Order 13771 was reducing regulations and controlling regulatory costs. It was an executive order signed in by Trump, and it required the agency to eliminate 2 regulations for every new regulation they wanted to put on the books. And a lot of people thought that was pretty arbitrary because, what if we need these particular regulations? And then there was also some economic actions imposed with that. And when Biden became president, he immediately evoked that executive order. So that is no longer a pressure point for them, which they were pretty stirred up about for a little while. And then there was also a proposed rule of a 10-year review of all regulations with automatic sunset provision at 10 years, meaning they just go away. And they were spun up about that as well. And I think that is probably being rolled back. I don't know if you have any more current information, but it's looking like that will be rolled back as well. So then that allows them to focus on increased enforcement activity, which we expect to accelerate during this year. Much more inspections for cause. They're back to on-site inspections, anticipating a lot more 483s coming from that and a lot more warning letters coming from that. And also follow-up specific to the EUA. They're not just, free to be on there and you don't have any follow-up. There's conditions, product performance sometimes that are that were authorized along with that. And so they may be following up on those things. As well as if a lot of clients are using the MDIS app for their audits, that frees up some of FDA's resources, and they're indicating that they may go with folks that have recently gotten pre-market clearance for 510Ks and for 510K exempt devices, seeing more inspections in that area.
Yeah, one of the points you raised was the EUAs that are out there right now, and that's something we haven't really talked about yet. We've talked a lot about, what do you do if you want to commercialize a product? Do you go EUA? Do you go 510K or another traditional pathway? But for those products that have EUA, the declaration is still in existence, but once it's removed, obviously they're going to have to take some steps to make sure they can continue to keep those products on the market. So I guess another question for the 3 of you would be, in preparation for that, and then once the declaration is removed, what would you say to these companies as far as steps to prepare themselves for the next wave, meaning the end of the declaration of the pandemic? Why don't we start with Carrie and then Patti?
Yeah, we recommend absolutely to get everything ready for a 510K because it doesn't preclude you from them requiring a full market clearance or approval. You have to get all of your safety testing and performance testing done, so to do it in parallel, and you can do them both in parallel paths. So that, there's certain requirements in the guidance and in the templates, that you must get done for the EUA, but you also still need to get, all your electrical safety testing done, all of your benchtop testing, all your biocompatibility, and get all those done and submit them and do it in parallel so that when they do withdraw the PHE, that you will, if you have 510K, it doesn't stop or, remove your market clearance and, eliminate or, interrupt market and or public need for your device.
Yeah, everything Carrie said, I totally agree with that. I hope, once again, that in addition to gathering all the data that you traditionally would have needed, you can also use some real world evidence in your 510K submission, because you will have that.
Now have the clinical data to further support your safety, performance, and data. And
exactly, and it also will help you in developing your CE, your clinical evaluation report. You'll have more data than you would normally have going into a 510K submission.
Especially with all these IVD devices and the IVR having to come enforced here now, you need your per data, right? So here you go. You can now, now that the MDR is enforced, now you can get your IVDR data, right? So use it.
Right.
Julie, anything to add on that issue?
No, I think they summarized that very well. Hopefully, the companies had enough foresight to say, hey, this will get me to market right away, but in parallel, I need to be preparing for the end of the timeline. So
one of the things, Julie, that I think we should touch on, which is a little bit of a outside of this, it's more of a general FDA issue, but what should we expect with the harmonization of the FDA's quality system regulation with ISO 13485?
right. A little history there. The FDA announced plans to harmonize with ISO 13485 back in 2018. The QSR, or 21 CFR Part 820, was last updated in 1996. So they recognize that they need to have a revision there. So Amy put out a document, a TIR 102 2019, which maps the QSR to 13485 and basically highlights the differences there. And since MDSAP was also a step towards that harmonization direction, FDA said, okay, there's some benefits here where we get regulatory convergence across the countries, and the harmonized QMS will make it a lot easier for manufacturers not having to meet two different sets of regulations, because there's definitely areas where they're not the same. It does introduce a much stronger tie to the risk management and the use of ISO 14971, which is definitely heavily into the 1345 standard. And hopefully it'll simplify handling things like CAPAs and risk management, labeling and complaints, which is where some of the differences were. So it's positive for manufacturers that are already certified to ISO 13485. It will take on a bit of work for folks that are only meeting or complying with QSR. Quite a bit would have to be done to bring it up to that 13485. So it kind of depends on where you sit, if this is really a good thing or not.
And what do you think, from a quality standpoint and just a process standpoint, do you see anything from the COVID pandemic and the FDA's experience throughout this process that could impact, its traditional pathways or processes or requirements going forward, whether short-term or long-term?
FDA is hesitant to change. So we'll see, huh? Right? Good. MedSap, I know they trained all of the notified bodies how to audit to MedSap, so they were a big part of that whole acceptance of that program. I think we're going to see a lot more of the FDA. I think I believe a lot of the U.S. clients got a little lackadaisical during COVID, in that we didn't see the FDA come knock on our doors a lot. I think they are going to start showing up, and I think we're going to see a lot more. Hopefully we won't, but there may be a lot more warning letters and a lot more 483s, and so hopefully that doesn't delay the initial, the acceptance of 13485 for the whole world. I don't know. We'll see. I don't know. Well, they've been talking about accepting 13485 for so long that
I won't predict what the FDA is going to do, but my hope is that they will continue the transparency that they've shown during the pandemic, especially, for instance, with their AdComs being online and anyone can come. I think that they have taken a look at their somewhat archaic ideas about innovation, and substantial equivalence is a paradigm that is directly against innovation, just by definition. So I'm hoping that those things remain, and that they are more accepting of things like artificial intelligence and machine learning, even though it's going to change their concept of validation, especially with machine learning. How do you validate something that keeps changing? And that is a question, but it's something that hopefully they will deal with, and that we will find some answers for that. And that's again where real world evidence comes in. You can't validate something that keeps changing. So what other aspects can you look at? You can look at the performance in the real world.
Yeah, absolutely. And the environment, the way the FDA has navigated this, and how you would expect them to navigate it, this current environment. Carrie, how have you seen any impact on that with regard to fundraising and investing in the different business aspects that are involved?
I mean, I have not seen a lot of monies being raised pre-FDA clearances or approvals. It seems a lot of hesitancy, unless you're getting grants or SBIR grants from the fundraisers, unless that you are getting a 510K through, for example. And then it seems fundraisers seem to, or investors seem to be a lot more willing to give these smaller boys monies, right? I don't know, on the device side anyway. Pharma still seems to have a lot of deep pockets, but.
Yeah, this is not really directly related to the FDA, but I think as I wear another hat, which is co-founder of Life Science Women's Conference. And what we see is a lot of money being raised by women and women's venture capital funds in the area of femtech. So I do see those kind of devices being able to raise money simply because of the increased spotlight on femtech. And for those of you who are not familiar with that term, it's products that are for women's health.
Yeah, that's a great clarification. So we're at our Q&A time, and we have one question that came in that's a really good one that we really haven't touched on yet, which is the FDA on track with timelines for pre-subs 510K submissions, or are they still backlogged due to the pandemic? I think, the question in particular on pre-subs is a good one that we should touch on. So Patti, why don't you go ahead and kick us off on that?
It depends on the division. It depends on the product. And it depends on if it's for COVID or not. If it's for COVID, they're right on track. In fact, faster, really, even for 510Ks. We're not talking about EUAs now. But in some divisions, they are still lagging behind. They have a huge backlog. So once again, it depends.
I want to add on to that. It's anticipated that the workload in this area will go up at FDA with the introduction or the implementation really of MDR. Much harder to get a product through the system in Europe now than it is in the US. And so companies, some are shifting and saying, we're going to launch US and then eventually we'll go to EU. And so I think that's a unexpected consequence of that rigid enforcement or the rigid regulation of MDR that may shift the workload to seeing a lot more submissions through the FDA.
And then also the QSub process isn't part of their MDUFA, so it's not within their incentives to get it done within X amount of time limit, right? So they have the proposed to get it to you within, 30 to 60 days, but that's not within their MDUFA. They are expected to try to get the 510Ks, reviewed within a 90-day time limit, and they're pretty good about getting those done with hard stops, but the QSubs are not. So you almost get I had a QSub that took almost 13 months versus a 510K. They'll do the stops. So, those, depending on the division again, because, but some 510Ks will go through faster than the silly QSub, depending on what groups and how many divisions you need to get incorporated. Because again, depending on the product code, if the indication is you require this division to look at the indication, but the product code is under this division, and how many people you need in the room to discuss whatever questions you have to do, it could take forever. I mean, we've had some QSubs where we ended up, it went back and forth. It was a digital product, and it ended up being a class 1 510K RX only device, 510K exempt at the end of the day for a, it was a QSub that turned into a 513G that ended up being an RX only 510K exempt device. So it was kind of a goofy, random one.
And sort of on the flip side, another question came in asking if anyone has experienced FDA giving much tighter timelines to the companies to respond to the FDA's questions. I think definitely the answer to that is yes. Who would like to speak to that?
You'll get a response and say, please respond by 3 o'clock COB. So, and that'll come in at 1 o'clock, and you need to respond by. So if I'm in Mountain Time, please respond by 3 COB Eastern Time. So you now have a half hour to respond. So, and that's based on their MDUFA, whatever you're at day 89, and you have to respond within an hour. So, I don't know.
There's another question in the queue. I'll repeat that.
You have to watch it. You have to count the days. So they are giving you, before you had the 180 days for when you got the hard stop, they are giving you the 180 days. So if you get an RTA, you now have 180 days to do the RTA response, and then if you get an AI, an additional information request, you get the 180 days now after that. Whereas, but watch those 180 days, because if you get towards the end of there, you now have within those hours of that, if you're at the 24th hour of the day 180, you're at the end of it, and that's about the time they're giving you. So they're watching those hours, but not on a Q sub.
So the next question is, do you think this instance of the EUA has affected the FDA's outlook or cooperation with medical innovation, especially those devices heavy in machine learning and internet connectivity? Anyone want to speak to that?
It depends. The cybersecurity stuff is goofy again, and IVD, they've had to move and accept, because you're dealing, if it hooks to mains and you're dealing with cybersecurity and it goes up to this cloud, wherever it is, you're passing patient confidential information, and you know that it needs to be encrypted. You need to have passwords, and you need to have plans in place for lifetime security in case it's, to make sure that, you don't want somebody to come in there and shut off somebody's pacemaker. Software lifecycle protection, it doesn't go away. You're going to have to be able to protect information throughout the life cycle of that product.
Patti, did you want to add something? I see you're unmuted.
I am, but I kind of lost track of the question because I was listening to Carrie. Can you repeat the question again?
Sure. Do you think this instance of the EUA has affected the FDA's outlook or cooperation with medical innovation, especially those devices heavy in machine learning and internet connectivity?
I hope so. Once again, I can't guess what the FDA is going to do, but I think that there have been plenty of examples of things that maybe the FDA didn't quite understand, but they authorized and it was okay. There's also been instances of things that the FDA authorized and didn't quite understand, and it wasn't okay, and they had to revoke the authorization. But like I said before, in the area, and this is one that I'm real familiar with, in the area of radiology, for instance, and approving software as part of that radiology package, and having that software learn what a particular kind of tumor looks like, and whether or not it's benign or malignant based on how it looks, and looking at all this big data that goes into those algorithms. I think the FDA is going to have to make a shift. They're going to have to be accepting, because if they don't, technology is just going to go to other countries. It's going to happen, whether it happens in the US or it happens in China. Really depends on the FDA's willingness to accept this kind of innovation.
The amount of documentation the FDA requires for software as a medical device even from 2 years ago, is astronomical. Like for a device only, they do not expect basically your whole device history file. For a piece of software, they do. You have to give them all of your validation, all of your verification, all of your traceability. You need to give them all of your software configuration plan. You need to give them all of your machine learning. You need to give them all of your cybersecurity. Now they're expecting you to give them your good machining learning practices, your cybersecurity plan, your algorithm learning plan, everything, all of it needs to go into your submissions. So based on your software level of concern, pretty much everything at this point is a moderate level of concern, unless you're like a pacemaker or controlling life, in which you're a major. And that's really hard for companies who even submitted software 2 years ago to understand that all of this documentation needs to be provided in your submission. And so that amount of documentation, you know, they require a lot in these submissions anymore in order for them to go through.
And I think ISPE and the FDA and several other agencies, collaborative effort to modernize computer system validation, or CSV, into computer quality and assurance is something that they have done in anticipation of having to look at this more complicated software and having to have the quality parameters in the manufacturer brought up to current standards in the industry of software development and software tools and machine learning and artificial intelligence and newer kinds of technologies that we now have and that we're going to have to deal with if we're going to innovate.
And the FDA's digital group's really good. They're very interactive, and you can send them a question and they respond very quickly. You know, as long as it's not a very deep, you know, long, huge request of information, they'll respond very quickly back with a quick response, you know. So in lieu of a Q sub, the digital health group is a pretty interactive group.
Another question that came up on the queue that I think would be a good question also to throw out to the audience and maybe get some audience stories is, are you working on any EUAs in progress currently, or anticipating it, considering it? Carrie, why don't you go ahead and start, since you're...
We still have a few that we are working with the agency. So there are still a few. There are product codes out there that still say COVID in there that are 510Ks. So, I mean, they're now putting them in the regulations. There are product codes that now include COVID-19. So COVID's not going to go away. It's now part of us. It's now going to be included as an IVD. It's, you know, I think it's going to be integrated into our health system forever now, in my opinion.
So maybe we can, oh, here's one more question. Does the panel believe that the FDA responds to large companies differently and more deferentially to small companies? Patti, you want to take that one first?
In most cases, I would say the FDA does not. In my experience, the NIH does. Getting grant money is definitely easier for large companies, probably because they have a track record. But in my experience, the FDA, in this pandemic, the FDA has been giving preferential attention, at least, to small companies, because small companies are the ones that are doing the innovations, or have been. But that's just my personal experience.
Julie, how about you? Do you have any thoughts on that question? Just in general experience, not even necessarily related to COVID.
Yeah, mine is from a little different perspective. I would say, as it relates to inspections, I would say not really much different, other than they do understand in a small company, you may not do everything, you know, to the fullest that you were if you were in a larger corporation, and some of the initiatives of documentation, they understand that certain things are a bit more brief. So I've seen that from being in both large corporations and small, that sometimes the they do show that understanding that you are a small company and you're very, connected and small and can interact easier than in a large corporation.
Carrie, anything to add in your experience?
They're not supposed to. I mean, they're people too. So I guess it depends, right? There's
Really, that question that was asked, is there a story behind that? Does someone have experience one way or the other about big versus large in the audience, that whoever asked that question?
I would love to know. Lisa, can we open it up, or is it open up to the audience? Maybe that can be elaborated on, that question.
Yes, Ryan, are you able to open up everybody's, well, we can ask, yes, we can ask everybody. This is Elisa. Does anybody have any specific FDA regulatory stories during this pandemic, during this time frame? We'd be happy to hear your experience to share amongst all the participants.
Yes, and I just want to add also, participants, please, of course, unmute yourselves if you're ready to speak. And of course, you're welcome to share your video if you'd like to. You're completely free to do that.
So I'll speak on behalf of that question regarding large, small. I didn't post that question, but my experience, for myself, Elisa, with the submission of an IVD diagnostic, COVID diagnostic, my feeling prior to this, I always defended FDA that there was no preferential treatment to large companies. My experience during this was that FDA had given preferential treatment to COVID diagnostics to large companies. There, from my interpretation and what was submitted, the data submitted by large companies was inferior to what was requested of my submission. And it continued to be so. And so I was, the FDA responded because they were looking for large companies who could have a huge output of diagnostics. So my perfect example of this is the Australian company who said that they could do a gazillion million diagnostic tests. They got all this fanfare from FDA. They got passed through super quick. And to this date, they haven't sold a single product into the US. So what we learned from this was that when you submit your EUA, this is a tip for the day, and I don't mean to say that we should falsify any data submitted to FDA, but if you say that you can produce a gazillion million IVD diagnostic tests for COVID, it seems like you will get preferential treatment. And I hope I haven't over-exaggerated anything.
Any audience stories? Oh, go ahead.
Well, I just think the larger companies have the money to get the data that the FDA requires faster than a lot of the smaller companies. And as the templates started to evolve throughout this, if you look at the specificity, especially in the IVD, a lot of the data and the accuracy and linearity and, you could see where a little bit more money was needed than a lot of the smaller companies had in some of that.
Here's another question, if there are no other stories. Has anyone hit a roadblock you were not expecting or had never seen before this pandemic, excuse me, due to any factors that are normally not present when working with the FDA? If so, how did you handle it? Did you guys get that? I mean to read that one again. Has anyone hit a roadblock you were not expecting due to factors that are normally not present when working with the FDA? And how was that handled? Anyone have thoughts on that?
I did not hit any roadblocks that I had not hit before.
Yeah, that seems to be the consensus. I think the answer to that is no on all accounts. I don't see any other questions from the audience. Elisa, do you want to?
Yeah, so we can ask.
Do you have any more to share?
Are there any participants that have a specific question to the panelists or to the moderator? You're welcome to ask, or a specific experience that you'd like to share. So
Yeah.
everybody gets along super great with FDA, and have there no horror stories or anything like this that you want to share?
This is Ryan again. I wanted to jump in. That was my question. I was hoping to get some juicy goodness going, but it sounds like we're all friends. So this is great. So unless there's anything else, ladies and gentlemen, Elisa, do you have anything for the last bits here?
No, but I was still hoping that somebody would come in with
No.
a question, or like, and it doesn't have to, for sure, it does not have to be EUA. I think we, it was, the intention was to be a much broader discussion. So if anybody has even a FDA regulatory question, you're welcome to ask it as well to the panelists and moderator.
I have a question.
Please.
And this may be out of scope, but I've been wondering, how long do we think it's going to take for the FDA to harmonize their regulations with MDR? And Julie talked a little bit about the effect of MDR becoming more difficult in Europe and the effect that that will have on the 510K here. But surely they've got to harmonize, right? Or no? What are y'all's thoughts on that?
I'm not sure. I think it's going to get bogged down like many of the other initiatives because it's so big. If you're going to make a transition to be more like the MDR, I mean, they've been trying to, to work through just the 13485 for how long? Years. And I don't know. I thought that the MedSap would have really pushed that along because everyone has, bought into that concept of basically harmonization there. But again, just really on the audit side, and I don't know how much that's going to go to the regulation side.
Okay.
I think there's one additional question that just came in. Does the panel believe the FDA process be better and will be better and faster in a year or two, or slower and more cumbersome? Julie, do you have thoughts on that?
I like Carrie's answer. It depends. It really does. It depends on the division and who you're working with and at what level, if it's 510K, PMA. I think there are many things that will get better because I think they've learned a lot through this time when they had to work in a different manner. And I think there's a lot of synergy and there's a lot of good things that will come from the devices that have gone through, EUA and will blossom into more. But then that also puts more things in the pipeline. So it's kind of hard to answer it in as a blanket. But I think you'll see definitely some improvements and things that get better and some things that may get a little bogged down.
What we're seeing is most of the divisions are very green. There is a lot of new reviewers, and they are all new and very young. How's that? And not necessarily in what I've been seeing experienced in the field. How's that? But then there's a lot of talk about them, expediting and making the 510K process a little bit more expedited and more efficient. So hopefully they'll get that, because a lot of these are non-significant risk, and it is a little onerous for some of these devices that are non-significant risk. You don't need to do all of this silly stuff for things that are, materials we've known that we've been using for 25, 30, 50 years don't need all of this testing if it's the same, right? So hopefully some stuff will get a little bit less onerous.
I think the answer lies in, it depends on who the leadership ends up being, and also what influence or what role Congress plays in the next few years as far as their priorities for the FDA. But FDA leadership, of course, is right now in flux, and we don't really know who the leader is going to be eventually. So I think that's a really important aspect of it. I think the prior leader that we had in Dr. Hahn was they didn't have the regulatory and the government experience that Janet Woodcock has. But I just think it depends on the leadership. I think it's a huge part of it.
And to me, that's frustrating, because I don't think government, who are politicians and don't understand the science and the health and the medical aspect of what this is supposed to be, what these devices and medicines are supposed to be doing, is for the public health and for, it's medicine, people. It's, it has nothing to do with politics. And I did, help with one EUA where Mr. Pence was on the phone, and he said it very well. I am here to support the EUA, but I am a politician and know nothing about medicine. And I'll let you guys who know stuff about medicine talk, and I'll now have nothing else to say and let you guys do what you do best. Period. I mean, that's how it should be, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Not up to politicians.
There are a couple more questions that have come in. Patti, I think this one relates to some of the information that you were talking about earlier, so maybe you can weigh in on this. Can the panelists share examples of successful use of real-world evidence in a submission? Any such examples?
Not yet. We have submitted some 510Ks using real world evidence, but they have not been approved yet. So I hope in a month that I will have an example of a successful use.
So there have been EUAs that have gone through where, the US wouldn't even look at them, but these devices have been cleared throughout the rest of the world, that once, the EUAs came through, once the pandemic came through, they've considered them as EUAs, and now they've now been cleared also as 510Ks. So, they're like, okay, yeah, I guess that does make sense that,
Yeah, I've seen some CE marked in vitro diagnostics that used real world evidence, especially products that came out of China, when China was the only country that really had patients to test these things on. And they used real world evidence to get their CE mark. but eventually they tried to get the EUA from the FDA, and it was at a point where the FDA was not looking at any more molecular diagnostic tests, so they wouldn't even look at it.
In your experience, has the biocompatibility demands increased? Can anyone speak to that?
So FDA released a guidance last year for common intact skin biocompatibility requirements, where you no longer require the testing for those. So for cytotox, irritation, and sensitization for common materials. So in that respect, they've decreased, but in other aspects, I believe they've increased. You know, they did release that other guidance as well in 2019, where they go above and beyond ISO 10993. So you need to look at it, and they have added other things that you need to consider and have a technical justification as to why they aren't required for your device over and above what 10993 requires. So both.
I agree. I think that would applies to changes in say changes in a supplier, even though it's the same part, you know, there may be machining it differently. And so they're really looking at proving that, you know, any of the coolants, cutting fluids, anything like that from one metal supplier are, you know, not different or more harmful than they are from another supplier. So it sometimes can be a paperwork exercise, but if there's not enough data available, then they're looking for testing.
And they just released in 2023 10993-23 for a new test for irritation. So that goes over and above the ISO 10993-10, which was sensitization in irritation. So now you get another standard you get to look at. So it depends, again, your normal regulatory counsel.
We've come full circle. I think we've gotten through all the questions that are currently in the queue. Any other questions? We still have a few minutes left. I don't think we have any further questions, so I'm going to send it back to Elisa to wrap up. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Well, thank you, Billee, our moderator, and our panelists. Thanks to everybody's participation. This will be recorded. This has been recorded, and we will post on the TMDA, Texas Medical Device Alliance website. And again, for everybody who's participating, please sign up for the monthly newsletter. It's a wealth of information, especially if you're new, but even if you're not new, you're welcome to, you know, contribute to information, or if you have, there's job postings, or if you want to post a job posting, there are references to, you know, different organizations in our area. So thanks to everybody. In October, we are having what's called like a vendor supplier summit. Everybody's welcome to participate. Our suppliers are going to, or suppliers in general in our industry are going to be present. And so hopefully it's a one-stop shop kind of event, so that you can meet, you know, a vendor or supplier from the napkin drawing, you know, design, prototyping, IP, etc., all the way through post-commercialization. So that is the big event in October. Granted that we can meet in October, that we don't go to stage 4 or 5 again. So we're looking forward to that. Ryan, do you have any last comments?
Actually, not on the topic, but I would like to send a thank you, of course, to all of our sponsors you see here on the screen, and also want to thank each and every one of you for taking time out of your day to join us for our meeting. I know, I think you've mentioned this, but our next meeting is going to be in October, on October 21st. So mark your calendars on that one. You'll see some more materials coming around. other than that, I hope everyone has a fantastic day.